In the dim, incense-soaked air of the Lateran Basilica, Rome held its breath. Torchlight flickered against frescoed walls as nobles, clergy, and soldiers filed into the ancient hall not for mass, not for coronation, but for judgment. The accused did not walk in. He did not speak. He did not breathe. He had been dead for months. His skin, discolored and tight as parchment, stretched grotesquely across his sunken skull. His eyes, long devoured by time, had been replaced by empty sockets that now stared blindly into the crowd. They dressed him in papal robes, vestments of gold and crimson, heavy with meaning, and propped him up on a throne. The ring of the fisherman, once a symbol of divine succession, was slid back onto decaying fingers around his lifeless neck. They draped the pallium. This was Pope Formosus, and this was his trial. It was called the Synodus Horrenda, the Cadaver Synod, a courtroom of the living judging the dead. To most of the onlookers, it was more nightmare than ritual. But in 897 AD, it was no dream. The 13th Pope of the 9th century, Stephen V, had ordered the corpse of his predecessor exhumed and tried for crimes he allegedly committed while alive. Beside the rotting body stood a trembling deacon, appointed as the corpse's legal counsel. His role, to answer questions on behalf of the dead pope and defend the indefensible. Each time Pope Stephen spat an accusation, "Did you usurp the papal seat?" the deacon mumbled a reply. The trial had all the trappings of Roman justice. Witnesses, formal charges, a public gallery. But it was steeped in something older, darker. This was not merely vengeance. It was spectacle, a warning, a performance of power where logic bowed to madness and Rome watched, the city. Once the beating heart of empire had long since decayed into a battleground for papal power and aristocratic intrigue. After Charlemagne's empire fragmented, local noble families clawed for dominance. And in this rotting vacuum, the papacy became a throne fought over with blood and bribes. Formosus had not been a saint, but neither was he a monster. He had navigated a fractured world, balancing loyalty between kings and emperors, backing the wrong men at the wrong time. In life, he had enemies, but in death, he became a symbol of corruption, of betrayal, of unresolved vengeance. Stephen VI, the man who orchestrated the trial, had reasons, political ones, psychological ones. He was installed by the powerful Spalato family, whose enemies Formosus had favored. But that alone doesn't explain it. Not entirely. There was something deeper in this grotesque ritual, a rage that had curdled into obsession. As the trial dragged on, Stephen's voice rose, his fury spilled into shouts. He paced before the corpse like a priest possessed. His words were aimed not just at Formosus, but at those who had ever doubted. Papal supremacy. He betrayed the seat of Peter. He cried. He broke canon law. He dared to anoint kings, not sanctioned by this holy office. Formosus, of course, did not respond. His body sagged in its robes, head tilting forward under the weight of death. Still, Stephen declared him guilty. They tore the robes from his corpse, cut off the 3 fingers that had given blessings, declared every act of his papacy invalid, the ordinations, the confirmations, the decrees, and then they threw him into the Tiber. The people of Rome was stunned. Even in a world accustomed to brutality and chaos, the Cadaver Synod was a horror beyond comprehension. Whispers turned to outrage. Rumors spread of curses, of omens, of divine disapproval. But for now, in that basilica, the echoes of madness had not yet died. The flickering torches cast long shadows across the marble floor. A corpse had been judged and condemned by a man who wore the same ring, sat on the same throne, and invoked the same God. Yet behind the sacred rituals lay something far more. Human, paranoia, vengeance, fear. A crumbling institution lashing out at ghosts to preserve its illusion of order. What broke in Stephen Vi? What dark thing compelled a man to drag a corpse from the grave not to bury it, but to punish it? That question would linger long after the throne was empty and the body lost to the river. For what had just occurred was not a trial. It was an exorcism of guilt by the guilty, a show trial where the dead had no voice and the living could not sleep. And as Rome reeled, the madness that had begun with one corpse would soon consume many more. Before he became a corpse on trial, Formosus had been a man of ambition, sharp-minded, cautious, and deeply aware of the fragile scaffolding that held the church together in an age of chaos. He was born in the mid-9th century, likely in Rome, during a time when the papacy was both throne and trappin office burdened with spiritual authority and soaked in political risk. Even by the standards of the era, Formosus stood out. He spoke well. He knew the law. He had a statesman's instincts. It wasn't long before he became Bishop of Ostia, one of the most prestigious ecclesiastical posts near Rome. From there, his influence only grew, but in the fractured politics of Christendom, talent was rarely a shield. In those years, the Church wasn't merely a spiritual institution, it was a battlefield. Frankish kings, Byzantine envoys, Italian dukes, and Roman aristocrats all viewed the papacy as a tool to be bent, bribed, or broken. And Formosus found himself at the eye of a relentless storm. He served as a papal legate in Bulgaria, a diplomatic role requiring subtlety and restraint. The Bulgarians were eager for a Christian identity, and Formosus impressed them. They asked the Pope to appoint him as their archbishop, but this was a dangerous request. Canon law forbade a bishop from holding 2 seats, and the Bulgarian appeal embarrassed other Roman clerics. That request would haunt him. Under Pope John VIII, the winds turned sharply. Formosus was suddenly accused of abandoning his post, of conspiring with enemies, of harboring ambition for the papacy itself. The punishment was swift and humiliating. Excommunication. Formosus was driven from Rome, stripped of his title, and forced into exile. But exile, like death, was not always permanent. When Pope John VIII was murdered, bludgeoned to death with a hammer by his own entourage, the tide shifted again. A string of short-lived popes followed, each one rising and falling in a cloud of bribery, betrayal, and blood. And, in 891, when the See of Peter stood empty once more, the cardinals turned to a man with experience, resilience, and quiet cunning. Formosus was elected pope. His enemies had been silenced or buried, his past sins absolved. His supporters believed he would bring calm to the chaos. But Rome was not a city that stayed calm for long. As Pope Formosus had little time to celebrate, he immediately found himself entangled in the same deadly game that had almost destroyed him before. The war between rival kings. The Carolingian Empire had splintered into civil war. In the west, the young and unstable Charles the Simple. In the center, the ambitious Odo of Paris. But it was in the east where Formosus cast his lot behind Arnulf of Carinthia, a Germanic warlord who promised protection for Rome. Formosus invited Arnulf to invade Italy and crown him Holy Roman Emperor, but fate intervened. Arnulf fell ill suddenly, mysteriously, just as he reached the gates of Rome. His army dissolved. The plan collapsed, and Formosus, having placed his bets, was left alone, again exposed. When he died in 896, Rome was still bleeding from the wounds of his decisions. The powerful Spalato family, furious at Formosus's alliance with their enemies, had lost their grip on the papal throne during his reign. But now, with Formosus buried and gone, they seized the moment, and they put one of their own, Stephen the Sixth, on the throne. What followed was not merely revenge. It was retribution so cold, so calculated. It reached beyond the grave. Formosus had spent his life navigating treacherous waters. He played kings against each other, survived exile, returned in triumph, and made choices meant to protect the church, to protect himself. He was neither villain nor martyr, just a man caught in history's undertow. But power does not forget, and those who lost it do not forgive. By the time his body was dragged from its tomb, Formosus had already lost the battle. The corpse trial that awaited him was not about guilt or innocence. It was about humiliation, control, and the terrifying reach of those who believed even death was no barrier to vengeance. And so, a pope who had survived exile, diplomacy, and imperial politics would face his final, most grotesque ordeal from a throne of bones. Formosus was dead, but in Rome, death was not the end. It was merely another move in a long and ruthless game. His body had barely cooled when the power brokers of the Eternal City began to scheme. Rome in the late 9th century was not a city of Saint Cit, was a battlefield littered with casarques and corpses, where the line between sacred and profane blurred with every papal succession. There were no peaceful transitions, no clean hands. The throne of St. Peter was a gilded trap, and every man who sat on it found himself surrounded by enemies before the incense stopped burning. And now, with Formosus gone, the Spelatons returned to collect what they believed was rightfully theirs. The House of Spalato, a powerful noble dynasty from central Italy, had been humiliated during Formosus's reign. He had rejected their chosen heir, had called foreign armies into their territory, and had elevated their rivals. When Formosus anointed Arnulf of Carinthia as Holy Roman Emperor, he didn't just defy local nobility. He insulted the entire Spalato name. They would not forget it in his place. They installed a man they could control, or so they thought. His name was Stephen the Sixth, a relatively obscure bishop with little power base of his own. He owed everything to Spalato, his robe, his ring, his rizzle gifts. And like any man bound by gratitude and fear, he would repay that debt with zealotry. At first, Stephen did what any new pope was expected to do. He affirmed his legitimacy, reassigned bishops, praised the Roman nobility. But almost immediately, whispers began to circulate that something was wrong, something off about the new pontiff. He spoke of Formosus constantly, not in honor, but in fury. He called him a liar, a usurper, a criminal who had defiled the chair of Peter. His sermons twisted into rants. His audiences ended in threats. Some believed he was performing for the benefit of his Spalato patrons, laying the groundwork for the erasure of Formosus's rule. But others suspected something darker. Behind Stephen's eyes, there was something unraveling. His mind, already fraying under the strain of power, began to slip. He stopped trusting his advisors. He turned on cardinals. He ordered confessions and retractions from priests who had been loyal to Formosus. Rome, already battered and weary, now trembled under the weight of a pope who seemed both puppet and fanatic. And then came the whispers of the trial. At first, no one believed it. A dead man on trial. It was madness, blasphemous even. But the rumors would not stop. Stephen, it was said, had ordered Formosus's corpse to be disinterred. He wanted it dressed in papal robes. He wanted it seated on a throne. He wanted witnesses, a trial, a spectacle, and behind closed doors, preparations began. This was not merely vengeance. It was degradation. A political execution masquerading as divine judgment. A message to Rome that Formosus's name would not just be erased, it would be dragged, literally, through the basilica's nave for all to see. Those around Stephen watched him change. He grew restless, paranoid, sleep-deprived. He saw betrayal in every corner. He muttered about heresies, about false ordinations, about the rot left behind by his predecessor. The court became a vulture's den filled with opportunists, informers, cowards, and sadists who smelled the blood in the water. And at the center of it all, Stephen VI, robed in authority, hollowed by madness. What exactly broke him is lost to time. Was it pressure from the spletens? Was it guilt, fear, power, or something deeper, a mind already cracking before the weight of the mitre? We will never know. What we do know is that he believed it was righteous to him. This was purification, a cleansing of the church, a ritual to exorcise a traitor from history, even if that traitor could no longer speak. Rome, meanwhile, slipped deeper into dread. Clergy whispered prayers not for salvation, but for survival. Nobles fled the city or watched from their palaces in mute horror. The streets grew quieter, doors stayed shut. It was not the plague, but something worser, moral sickness rotting the center of Christendom. And then, in the heart of the Lateran Basilica, the unthinkable happened. Formosus was dug from his grave. What followed was one of the most grotesque spectacles in the long and violent history of the Church. But it did not begin with shouts. It began with silence. The kind of silence that settles in just before a storm. The kind that seeps into stone, into cloth, into skin. Stephen had summoned the corpse. Now he would summon judgment at dawn. The tomb was opened. The men sent to retrieve the corpse of Pope Formosus worked in near silence, gagging from the stench. His body, 9 months buried, was bloated and stiff. The eyes were gone, the skin jaundiced and curling. He was unrecognizable, as the man who had once walked the halls of the Lateran palace. But none of that mattered now. What mattered was what Stephen VI wanted, a puppet for punishment. A dead man who could be displayed, humiliated, judged. The corpse was washed, somewhat then robed in papal vestments, silk robes of gold, a mitre atop his rotting head, and the pallium placed over the shoulders. His decomposing hands were wrapped around the cross. And then, in a moment that would stain the church for centuries, he was propped upon a throne, a literal throne, placed at the center of the Lateran Basilica. A deacon stood beside him, trembling. His role was to answer questions on behalf of the dead. The Synodus Horrenda had begun. It was not a closed-door affair. Nobles, clerics, and members of the Roman public had been invited to attend or coerced. Many came out of fear. Some came out of fascination. Most left in horror. As the trial opened, Stephen VI entered in full regalia, robes flowing, the papal tiara shining. But his face betrayed, him twisted, pale eyes sunken with sleeplessness. He approached the throne, looked into the lifeless sockets of his predecessor, and began to speak, not softly, not prayerfully, he shouted. "Pope Formosus," he bellowed, "you are accused of perjury, of coveting the papacy, of violating the canons of the Church." The crowd was still, not in respect, but in shock. This was not symbolic. It was not a mock trial, nor a play. This was, in every technical sense, a formal ecclesiastical proceeding. Witnesses were called, clerics were questioned. The charges were listed and read aloud, as though the accused could rise from the throne. To answer them, each time Stephen shouted an accusation. The terrified deacon beside the corpse would reply quietly, shamefully. A strange echo chamber of madness. One voice screaming judgment, another offering hollow defense, while the central figure dead, rotting sat in silence. The charges, though absurd, were rooted in real grievances. Formosus had, allegedly, become Bishop of Rome while still holding his post as Bishop of Ostia, violation of canon law. He had, they claimed, conspired against Pope John VIII. He had aligned with foreign kings and placed the Church in the hands of outsiders. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. This wasn't about canon law. This was about control. Stephen was here to do more than condemn a predecessor. He was here to erase him. As the hours dragged on, the mood shifted from confusion to revulsion. Even Stephen's most hardened allies began to shift in their seats. A bishop muttered a prayer under his breath. A noblewoman fainted and was carried out. But Stephen pressed on, driven not by law but obsession. He circled the corpse like a vulture, his voice cracking, his face growing redder with every accusation. He called Formosus a fraud, a heretic, a traitor to God, and still, the corpse slumped in its chair, slowly collapsing under its own decay. At last, the verdict was read, guilty on all charges. But the trial did not end with words. Stephen demanded punishment, physical punishment, for a man who had long since passed from the realm of pain. First, they stripped the corpse of its vestments. The papal robes were torn off, ripped from the fragile body like trophies looted from the dead. The mitre was thrown to the floor. The ring of the fisherman's symbol of divine authority was pried from his withered finger. Then came the ritual mutilation. Stephen ordered that the 3 fingers of blessing, the right-hand digits with which popes offered benedictions, be severed. The knife cut into decaying flesh with a sickening sound. What remained of the fingers were discarded, as if severing them could sever memory itself. The body was dragged from the throne, its limbs now limp and broken. No longer adorned in robes, no longer recognized as a pope, it was chained, insulted, spat upon, and then, unceremoniously, the remains of Pope Formosus were tossed into a shallow grave. But even that was too merciful. Stephen changed his mind. He ordered the corpse exhumed again, this time not for trial, but for total erasure. The body was taken to the banks of the Tiber, bound in weights, and cast into the river. Rome watched in silence as the river swallowed its most blasphemed pope. For Stephen, the act was complete. He had judged, condemned, and buried not just a man, but a legacy. He believed the church was cleansed, but the water did not forget. Days later, the corpse of Formosus waterlogged, battered, washed ashore. A monk found it and, in secret, buried it again with dignity. Rumors spread that the body had refused to sink, that God had spared it, that justice had not been served, but desecrated, and Rome once again began to whisper. Stephen had won his trial, but something darker had begun to unravel. The trial was over, the corpse thrown, the verdict delivered, But Rome did not feel cleansed, it felt haunted. The cadaver synod had sent ripples through the city not of triumph, but of sickness. What was meant to be an act of justice, or power, or purification, now curdled into something far more dangerous, fear. The people whispered of curses, of devils, of a pope who had spoken with the dead. Women refused to enter the Lateran basilica. Priests performed masses with trembling hands. A few, too shaken to continue, abandoned their orders altogether. Even hardened soldiers who had attended the trial reported sleepless nights. The image of the corpse on its throne, its head swaying as if nodding to its own doom, would not leave them, and in the streets the mood turned. Stephen VI, once seen as a stern hand of God, now appeared unhinged. His sermons grew angrier, more erratic. He ranted about Formosus from the pulpit. He saw plots in every shadow. Cardinals were accused of disloyalty. Monks were interrogated. Some were imprisoned. One bishop was found dead face down in a fountain, his tongue cut out. What had begun as political theatre had evolved into a reign of terror. The Roman nobility, already uneasy with Stephen's ties to the Speletons, began to act. For them, the cadaver synod had not been righteous, it had been humiliating. Rome, the heart of Christendom, had become a punchline whispered in every court from Gaul to Bavaria. And they blamed Stephen. Inside the curia, opposition mounted. The same nobles who had smiled during the trial now plotted in silence. They reached out to rival factions. They stoked the embers of rebellion. And soon the whispers turned to action. A mob gathered at the edge of the city. Quietly at first, then louder. They carried no banners, no organized militias, just citizens furious, frightened, ashamed. As the sun dipped below the dome of the basilica, the gates were forced open. The papal guard, either complicit or indifferent, stood aside. Stephen VI was dragged from his bed. It is said he screamed for mercy, that he tried to explain, that he insisted he had only obeyed God. But no one listened. Not this time. He was thrown into a dungeon, iron shackles on his wrists, his papal garments stripped away. For months he rotted in the same darkness. He had forced upon Formosus. There would be no trial for Stephen, no deacon to speak on his behalf, no throne, only judgment. In August 897, less than a year after the cadaver synod, Stephen VI was strangled in his cell. Some say it was the guards, others claim it was the mob. A few believe it was suicide. But it hardly mattered. Stephen was dead, and Rome breathed again. The Church, sensing the depth of the rot, rushed to clean the wound. His decrees were annulled. Formosus's mutilated body, once fished from the river and reburied in secret, was restored to its rightful tomb in St. Peter's. A new pope was elected, one who promised dignity, silence, normalcy. But the scar could not be hidden, because Stephen's madness had been contagious. Not just psychological madness, but moral madness. A sickness that twisted piety into spectacle, that turned justice into theatre, that taught men it was possible, even holy, to punish the dead. And once that door was opened, it could never fully be closed. For the papacy, the damage was lasting. For Rome, the shame was permanent. And for Formosus, though long dead, his story had just begun. The Tiber flowed as it always had, slow, sullen, brown, with the waste of empire and time. But now it carried something more. The body of a pope. When the court of Stephen VI was finished with the trial, when the stolen vestments were torn away, when the corpse had been condemned and mutilated, they did not return Formosus to the earth. They hurled him from the stone bridge into the river, as if Rome could forget him if the current claimed him. But rivers do not forget, nor do the people who live beside them. Fishermen swore the water turned black where the corpse sank. Children said the river whispered his name at night. One account claimed that a monk, rowing alone across the Tiber at dusk, saw a pale hand breach the surface, pointing toward the palace. It was superstition, folklore, madness, but it caught fire because, no matter how fiercely the church tried to reclaim its image, the people could not forget the spectacle, and the Tiber, always there, always moving, became the stage for a new kind of trial, one conducted not by cardinals, but by rumor. And then, impossibly, the corpse returned. Months after the cadaver synod, Formosus's body was found, caught in the reeds, still draped in fragments of papal silk, the jaw twisted in a silent scream. A few loyal priests, horrified but reverent, took the remains and buried them secretly, not in a tomb, but in a catacomb, away from the gaze of mobs and monarchs. Still, the image remained, a river made holy and profane, a dead pope that would not rest. In the months that followed Stephen's death, the Vatican twisted in the wind. Pope Romanus attempted to soothe the crisis by annulling Stephen's rulings, but he lasted only a few weeks before he was deposed. His successor, Theodore II, ruled for just 20 days, long enough to restore Formosus's body to its tomb at St. Peter's, long enough to pretend decency had returned, but the waters of Rome had already been fouled. The next pope, John X, tried to seal the wound. He banned posthumous trials, declared the cadaver synod invalid, and called for the records to be destroyed. But scrolls survived. Memories clung like mold, and the Church's quiet reversal could not silence what had already been seen, nor could it undo the deeper truth that the papacy had become a battlefield, that even the bones of a dead pope were fair game in a war for power. Across the city, loyalties twisted. Clerics wondered if they too would be condemned after death. Bishops looked over their shoulders. The sacraments began to feel hollow. The throne of St. Peter no longer stood above the chaos. It was the chaos. And still the Tiber flowed in later years as children played near the banks. Mothers would warn them, "Stay away from the water, the Pope is still watching." Artists painted shadowed figures, half submerged in murky currents. Writers, generations later, would call the river Rome's guilty conscience. In whispered prayers, some even begged Formosus for forgiveness not from heaven, but from the filth of man, because what Stephen had done was not just a grotesque trial, it was an inversion, a perversion, the very thing the Church feared most, that its holiness could be undone by spectacle, and the river bore witness to it all. It became a symbol of failed erasure, of death made public, of shame that refused to sink, even as the papacy moved on, even as fresher scandals drowned out. Older scenes, the cadaver synod, lingered like a corpse trapped in the mud, unseen, but always there, always waiting, because in Rome nothing is ever truly buried, and the river knows your sins. In the long shadow cast by the cadaver synod, the Church tried to forget, but forgetting was impossible, because the ghost of Formosus was not buried with his bones. It remained, echoing down the corridors of power, lingering in the whispered confessions of bishops, and clawing at the conscience of a church that had turned its altar into a courtroom. It was not just that a pope had been tried after. Death It was that he had been found guilty, that a council of living men had screamed judgment into the face of a rotting corpse and believed it would bring closure. Instead, it opened something deeper, a wound that bled into the very soul of Christendom, even after Pope John IX attempted to erase the past, declaring the cadaver synod null, banning posthumous trials, and hiding away the surviving documents. The stain would not lift. Formosus's name could not be scrubbed from the scrolls of history. His image, once painted in solemn gold-leafed icons, now appeared in mocking caricatures across Rome, and the people remembered. They remembered how a holy man had been pulled from his grave, mocked, mutilated, and thrown to the river. They remembered the silence of the saints, the cruelty of the clergy, and the way God had not intervened. Even the devout began to ask, if the Pope himself is not safe in death, who is? The Vatican tried to move on. New popes were elected, edicts were issued, vestments were sewn, relics enshrined, but every new ritual felt hollow. Every sermon rang with a shadow beneath it, because beneath every chalice was the ghost of Formosus. His presence haunted the minds of those who followed him, even those who hated him, and especially those who had tried to use his death for their gain. Like Pope Sergius III, he came to power more than a decade later, long after Stephen VI had died strangled in a cell. Sergius was no stranger to scandal. He had been part of the original synod that condemned Formosus, and once he seized the papal throne, he reversed everything once again. He declared the cadaver synod valid. He recondemned Formosus, reasserted the guilt, tried once more to crush the memory under layers of political dominance. But the more he pushed, the louder the echoes grew, because the truth had changed. The cadaver synod was no longer just a judgment. It was a myth, a mirror, and a warning. It was a parable of power unmoored from morality, of a church that ate its own. And every time a pope tried to manipulate the story for his own purposes, the deeper the church sank into self-parody. The people could see it. They could see how the papacy was no longer a line of divine succession, but a throne of blood and vengeance. How one pope could damn the next. How the tomb was no shield from ambition. The Roman clergy had become a snake, devouring its own tail. Each reversal, each decree only deepened the absurdity. Formosus was condemned, then restored, then condemned, again. He was buried, dug up, reburied, canonized in whispers, cursed in proclamations. And yet, despite the chaos, his influence only grew, because what could be more powerful than a pope whose voice was louder in death than in life? Theologians wrestled with the implications. Could a corpse commit perjury? Could sacraments be undone posthumously? Could one pope erase another? In an age when the papacy claimed infallibility, these questions were dangerous, because if Formosus was guilty, then all he had ordained, priests, bishops, kings, were invalid. If he was innocent, then the church had committed blasphemy on a global stage. There was no clean escape, so instead, the church turned to silence. The records were buried deeper. The sermons ignored the topic. The artists stopped painting his face. But in private, behind locked doors, the high clergy still spoke of him, in low tones, with fear, because they knew that the cadaver synod had broken something sacred, that beneath the wealth, beneath the chants and incense, there was now a rot. Formosus had become the church's unquiet conscience, a relic not of faith, but of failure, and that legacy would linger, long after Sergius III was dead, long after the Papal States fractured and Rome was ravaged by war, long after the Reformation would come to accuse the Church of corruption, even then the name Formosus would whisper through the centuries, a name few would speak, but none would entirely forget, because he was proof that power can desecrate, that institutions can devour themselves, that no title, no robe, no golden ring can protect a man from the monstrous hunger of politics, and most of all, that sometimes the dead are louder than the living, especially when they have been forced to speak. They called it a return to order, but what Sergius III unleashed was something else entirely, not a restoration, but a reckoning. He had waited in the shadows for years, long enough to see Stephen VI rise and fall, long enough to watch popes cancel each other like figures on a game board. Now, finally, it was his turn to rule. And when Sergius took the throne in 904 AD, he did not come in peace. He came with a list. He had never forgotten Formosus. More specifically, he had never forgiven those who tried to rehabilitate him to Sergius. The Cadaver Synod had been righteous, a bold, if grotesque, defense of orthodoxy. He had been there, one of the judges, one of the voices crying guilty into the abyss. And in the years since, he had watched with rage as others tried to sweep it all under the altar. So the moment he had power, he did what so many before him had done. He reversed everything. The synod that had nullified Formosus's condemnation, cancelled. The popes who tried to rehabilitate him, declared illegitimate. The dead pope himself, re-condemned again from beyond the grave. It was as if time bent backwards. Formosus was dead, his bones buried, his mouth long silent. But once more, he became the center of the papal universe, and for Sergius, that was only the beginning. He purged Rome, bishops were replaced. Judges who'd ruled in favor of Formosus were excommunicated or disappeared. Loyalists were elevated, enemies were smeared. Those who whispered sympathy for the disgraced corpse pope knew better than to do so aloud. This was no longer the papacy of saints and shepherds. It was a regime, and behind the gilded doors of the Lateran palace, a darker force stirred, because Sergius was not ruling alone. He had allies, ruthless ones. The most powerful among them was Theophylact I, a Roman noble who commanded armies, wealth, and the allegiance of the city's aristocracy. But it was not Theophylact who held true power in the shadows. It was his daughter, Marozia, barely a teenager when she entered Sergius's inner circle. She quickly became his mistress and, as many sources whisper, the mother of his child. That child would one day sit on the papal throne himself, Pope John XI. But for now, Marozia served a different role. She was the beginning of something new, a shadow dynasty that would rule the church not through holiness, but through seduction, blood, and control. The historians would call it the pornocracy, the rule of harlots. But that crude term masks something deeper and darker. It was a turning point. Where once popes were seen as chosen by God, they were now pawns of aristocratic clans, and Sergius, for all his power, was the first pawn in a long, corrupt game. His reign was steeped in paranoia. He trusted no one. He feared rivals at every corner. The papal treasury was drained to secure mercenaries, fortresses, and bribes. Religious ceremonies became displays of political dominance, and always, looming in the background, was the spectre of Formus. It was as if condemning him again had not banished the ghost, but awakened it. For every step Sergius took forward, Another scandal followed. Whispers of murder, of forged documents, of incestuous alliances. Rome was no longer just the center of Christendom, it was a battlefield, and the Pope, far from being a shepherd, had become a warlord. Still, he ruled for 7 years. 7 years of backroom deals, purges, and quiet screams in marble chambers. 7 years of sanctifying cruelty with incense and scripture. But Sergius could never fully control what he had unleashed. The Cadaver Synod had taught the Church that death was not the end, that even bones could be judged, even tombs could be. Political. And in that environment, no pope was truly safe. Sergius had exhumed not just a corpse, but a culture. One where retribution was eternal, and legitimacy was always in question. When he died in 911, there was no great mourning. The people of Rome had long stopped seeing the Pope as a father of the Church. He was another name in a cycle of violence. Another man who wore white robes while his hands were red. But the damage had been done. Under Sergius, the papacy had become a throne not of faith, but of faction. A stage where personal vengeance could be dressed in holy garments, and in the silence after his death, the Church stood trembling, not because it had rid itself of a tyrant, but because it had lost even the memory of what the papacy once meant. The reign of Sergius was not a correction, it was a deepening, a descent, and now, as new rivals clawed for power and Rome's noble families turned their eyes to the keys of St. Peter, a darker age was poised to begin, one where not even the saints could save them. They called it the Pornocracy. The rule of whores. It is a name whispered with disgust across the centuries, a stain on the Church's history so foul. Many historians tried to write around it, but facts, like bones, resist burial, and the truth is darker than the slur suggests, because this was not simply a tale of carnal sin. It was a cold, calculated conquest, and at its center stood one woman, Marozia, daughter of Theophylact I. Marozia had grown up in power's shadow. She learned quickly that Roman nobility held the papacy like a blade, not a blessing. Her alliance with Pope Sergius III had given her a son, one destined, in time, to wear the tiara himself, but it also gave her a taste for rule, not spiritual rule, absolute rule. And when Sergius died, Marozia didn't retreat, she advanced. One pope after another rose and fell, but none without her touch. Some were lovers, some were pawns. All were tools to understand the pornocracy. We must forget the image of the Pope as a solitary shepherd. Instead, picture a gilded throne held aloft by bloodlines, seduction, and murder. Marozia did not need to sit on it herself. She made others sit, and bowed their heads to her will. Her first major move came through Pope John X. Unlike some of her other selections, John X was a capable man, ambitious, militarily strong, and at first independent. Too independent. He had the gall to resist her influence. Marozia responded not with argument, but with annihilation. She turned Rome's factions against him, accused him of treason, and finally threw him into prison where he was almost certainly to death. The message was clear. No pope crossed Marozia. Then came Leo VI, a mere shadow of a man. He did as she said. So did Stephen VII, and John XI, her own son by Sergius III. Yes, her son. In a grotesque twist. Marozia became the mother of the Pope while still ruling from behind the curtain. Rome had never seen such a concentration of dynastic control over the Holy See, but it was not divine order. It was dynastic exploitation. the church became a stage for family revenge. Bishops were sold their positions. Cardinals were appointed by bribe. Scenes were absolved for the right price. And through it all, Marozia remained untouchable until she reached too far. Her ambition grew past even her own legacy. She arranged a marriage to the King of Italy, hoping to create a papal monarchy under her family's grip. It was a bold vision, to bold in 932, her son Alberic II, the half-brother of Pope John XI, turned on her. He led a coup, stormed the Lateran palace, and imprisoned his own mother. The woman who had once dominated the Holy See was now locked in the same dungeons where she had thrown her enemies. Her reign, brilliant, terrifying, unprecedented, was over. But the world she created, that would linger, because Marozia had reshaped the very structure of papal power. She had shown that the Holy See could be bought, seduced, manipulated, that its throne could become a seat of empire if one had the right blood and the right ruthlessness. The pornocracy was not merely about lust. It was about control, and though Marozia was gone, her family endured. Alberic II ruled Rome for over 2 decades, installing his own candidates as popes, and when he died, his son Marozia's grandson became Pope John XII. Thus began another era of scandal. John XII was young, wild, and debauched. He turned the Lateran into a brothel. He gambled in the papal halls. He was accused of invoking pagan gods during his drunken orgies, and yet he was pope because he had the blood. The pornocracy had ended officially, but its poison had seeped deep into the church's marrow. What began as a period of manipulation by a Roman noblewoman had turned into a generational corruption. The very idea of spiritual authority had been replaced by birthright, betrayal, and backroom deals, and the people of Christendom, watching from afar, could only weep. The vicar of Christ was no longer a shepherd. He was a puppet king, moved by invisible hands, whose strings ran through the beds and bloodlines of Rome. And yet the throne remained, glittering, all-powerful, untouched by shame, because for all its scandals, the Church still held the power of eternity. Even the darkest century could not unmake the myth. Even as the walls of the papacy shook with corruption, pilgrims still came, knees still bent, prayers still rose into the smoke, because what choice did they have? The Church was the only bridge between earth and salvation, even if that bridge was rotten, and so the faithful endured, and the popes kept rising, some born of violence, others destined for it. And somewhere, beneath the echoing vaults of Rome, the bones of Formosus lay still, silent, watching, and waiting. The cadaver synod was not the end of madness. It was the beginning of a long, festering wound. Centuries would pass before the Church would fully recover its moral authority, if it ever did. What began as a grotesque display of vengeance, the trial of a dead pope, became a symbol of everything the papacy could become when corrupted by ambition, fear, and bloodlust. And its shadow fell long across history. After Formosus's desecrated body was thrown into the Tiber, after Sergius III war, the tiara and Marozia tightened her grip on the Holy See. A silence settled over the Church's annals. A silence not of peace but of shame. No official documents recorded the cadaver synod with clarity. No sermons explained it. No pope ever confessed to its sin. Instead, it was buried. Not the body, his corpse was recovered and reburied with some honor by those who still believed in him. But the truth, the hideous truth, was sealed behind the walls of Vatican memory. Even so, whispers endured. Theologians in later centuries would wrestle with the implications. What happens when the Church, the vessel of divine justice, turns on itself with such fury that it desecrates its own sacraments? What becomes of apostolic continuity when one pope unpopes another, even after death? Formosus had ordained bishops. Were they invalid now? Were all the sacraments they administered meaningless? Was the grace of God that flowed through their hands revoked by the rotting bones of an unblessed corpse? It was theological madness, a doctrinal nightmare. The Cadaver Synod cracked the illusion that the papacy was a sacred, unbroken line. It exposed something darker, that popes were men, mortal, petty, brutal, and some were monsters. The Protestant Reformation, centuries later, would look back at this episode as proof of Rome's decadence. Luther's followers would cite it as the nadir of Catholic corruption. The Catholic Church, desperate to defend its continuity, brushed it aside, labeled it an aberration, a moment of political madness, divorced from the true mission of the faith. But history doesn't forget. The image is too grotesque. A pope, dead, for months, dressed in ceremonial robes, tied to a chair, fingers rotting, mouth agape, accused, condemned, stripped of his priesthood, dismembered. This is not the stuff of parable. It is the record of the Church's darkest hour. And in that darkness, something lingers, because the Cadaver Synod wasn't just a singular crime, it was a revelation. It showed that no institution, no matter how sacred, is immune to rot when power becomes the only altar. It warned of what happens when fear overrides faith, when politics drowns morality. Formosus, in death, became the mirror the Church could not bear to look into, and yet, even in disgrace, he would not disappear. His legacy survived, not through papal edicts or councils, but through the grotesque endurance of the tale itself. Artists, chroniclers, and skeptics kept the story alive. In 1870, during the First Vatican Council, nearly 1,000 years after the Synod bishops debated the doctrine of papal invalidity, and some, quietly, raised the ghost of Formosus. How? They asked, can we claim infallibility when one pope desecrated another with such finality? There was no answer, because the Cadaver Synod is the answer. It reminds us that institutions built on faith can falter when their foundations are compromised by cruelty, that the divine, when filtered through man, can become monstrous, and yet perhaps most chilling of all is. This the Cadaver Synod was legal. There was no law forbidding it, no canon that said a corpse could not stand trial. The Church had no script for such madness, and so the madness was allowed to proceed, unchecked, unpunished, unrepented. The body of Formosus was condemned, not by pagan hands or foreign invaders, but by his own successors, by those who called themselves shepherds. And though time moved on, and popes were crowned, and the basilicas filled once more with incense and song, the sin remained, not on parchment, but in memory, because there is something about the macabre that refuses to fade. It sticks, it whispers, and in quiet moments, beneath the gilded domes of Vatican City, the question lingers still, what if it happens again? Not in the same grotesque way, but in spirit. What if power once more triumphs over principle? What if fear returns to the altar? The Cadaver Synod does not live on in liturgy, it lives on in warning, and the bones of Formosus, wherever they truly rest, are not silent. They echo still,